Hello and welcome all. I'm Joe here from my co-host Dan.
Hello and greetings.
And we just got finished watching Karate Kid 2. This movie, right off the hop, is a great movie. Easily on par with the first one. In some ways not as good, in some ways better. It's hard to rate it in comparison to the other one. It really feels like it completes the first movie. And the first half hour or so is basically the first movie. Just scenes that were cut because the studio were feeling a little douchey towards the director. So we, of course, get the car park parking lot scene. The parking lot scene where Johnny gets... Well, okay. Kreese tries to murder Johnny. And I know there's going to be the weird Kreese fanboys who for some reason think Kreese is redeemable or a great guy. I don't know where that belief came from with Cobra Kai. Like, they think Kreese is a nice person or redeemable. He's not. He's scum.
He tried to kill a kid.
Yeah, and here he genuinely tries, and Johnny's friends are trying to tell Kreese, hey, stop it. You're strangling him. He can't breathe. His face is turning red. And he slaps them around, kicks them around, and beats them while strangling Johnny, who's blacking out, it looks like. Miyagi hurries over, panicked, and stricken for poor Johnny, telling him to let Johnny go. Saves Johnny, whom drops to the ground. Well, sort of. He almost drops, and his friends catch him and pull him away so that he could start breathing, and they're patting him on the back. In turn, Kreese tries to murder Miyagi after name-calling him a rather racist name. And Miyagi defeats him without swinging a single punch, just getting him to bloody up his knuckles a little, then scares Kreese. Kreese is honestly such a coward, and I love this scene showing that Kreese is not a courageous man. He's a cowardly man who does not have an ounce of bravery in him. Because the minute he's threatened with death, he starts pleading with his eyes and pleading for his life. And Miyagi mocks him and just says, seriously, essentially, that those who are enemies should deserve no mercy. Then he spares Kreese in a gesture while pretending to honk his nose, as if to say that Kreese could never be his enemy because he's too weak. And you just have Kreese who breaks down crying at Miyagi's feet. No joke, like if you observe closely enough, he's crying like a baby. It is so pathetic. It is so enjoyable. I love the actor for Kreese. He's a great actor. But I just love seeing Kreese's character humiliated and broken like that. I love Miyagi. Anyways, the movie then skips forward 6 months where we see that Ali lied in Cobra Kai because she said that I warned you about the brakes and about the fender and whatnot, when according to Danny, no, and apparently he lent the vehicle out to Ali. She took off with it, and apparently at the prom, admitted to Danny that she had been cheating on him with a football player from USCLA, I think it is. So that Danny took off mid-prom because he was just not interested in staying there. So apparently, Allie went to the prom to inform him that she's been cheating on him and seeing someone else. So that's a rather bad prom. I mean... yeah. Ali in Cobra Kai claims, there's a lot in her story that there seems to be holes in it. But then when you actually watch Karate Kid 2, you go, oh, so she was lying and cheating. And you know what? I'm not saying she was a bad person. By far, she was not. In the first movie, she played games with Johnny and Danny's heads. It's just as a teenager, she was a manipulative brat and a spoilt little rich girl. She, sadly, after Karate Kid, partway through Karate Kid 2, I think she appears for one scene because of the Karate Kid 1 scenes. She sadly had to go through the life of hard knocks and suffered a divorce, apparently, possibly some child alienation, which I don't think she deserved any of that.
No.
I honestly don't think she even deserved having her husband, I think, walk out on her and cheat on her or something. Like, from what it's implied in Cobra Kai. Like, the way life turned out for her seems to have been harder than what she deserved. I do think there was a good person in there. It's just, when it came to Johnny and Danny, she did not treat them well. And
Which explains the one scene in Cobra Kai where Danny and Johnny bond over their failed relationships with Ali.
Yeah. And it's just, I dislike them trying to retcon out that she was at fault for the breakup, when it's actually consistent considering how she treated Johnny. The consistent factor in the bad relationships with Ali is Ali. But I like the idea that by Cobra Kai, she's grown up. And she even is kindly and gentle enough to bring the rivals together. That said, now we get to the Okinawa part. The fact that this movie has to be divided in two is just... Anyways, Mr. Miyagi finds out his dad is dying because he's apparently 90-some. Which, wow. Talk about good living over in Okinawa. That said, Mr. Miyagi decides he's got to go back home. This after he taught Danny to find peace with the breakup with Ali. In that he teaches him to center himself and teaches him a new technique that's more focused on inner peace. And it's a really beautiful scene. Although I do like Danny whining. Like, how come it is that whenever I come to you with a problem, you always have work for me, and you have Mr. Miyagi, convenient coincidence, or something like that. It's just, Mr. Miyagi brushes it off. I think he's just using Danny for cheap labor to an extent.
Why wouldn't he?
Yeah, I know. Danny gets something out of it, and so does Mr. Miyagi.
I mean, you've got this obnoxious teenage punk full of hormones that's very aggressive. You need to convince him to
use up his energy in a productive manner. That said, Mr. Miyagi goes to Okinawa. Danny spends his entire college fund on getting to Okinawa with Mr. Miyagi at the last minute, with Miyagi reluctantly letting him come along. Danny, having bought himself a Okinawa history book in the bookshop of the airport, tags along and then proceeds to be the very worst airplane seat partner you can have when he keeps wanting to talk about Okinawan history and little trivia stuff, which annoys Miyagi a little. But at the same time, the two bond. Now, we also found out that Sato was Miyagi's rival and that they did favors for each other. Sato had Miyagi trained as a fisherman by his dad. In turn, Miyagi had his own father teach Sato Miyagi-Do karate. The trouble is, Sato has since become a wealthy business owner because his dad bought a large commercial vessel and ran the other fishermen out of business, so that they had to resort to vegetable crop growing and selling their crops. This after the village was forced to move because of the military air base of the U.S. that the American military decided to build. Sato, in turn, took ownership of the land the village reestablished itself upon, much to the irritation of Mr. Miyagi. With that said, Sato, at the end of the movie, does turn over the land deed to the village and vow never to take it back from them. This after an extended villainous arc on his part. His nephew, Chosen Takuchi, turns out to be a bit of a criminal and someone guilty of things like forgery, petty crimes, petty theft, and he even does the rude gesture of taking Danny's book when they're in the warehouse and tossing it at Danny's feet with a sneer, which in Japanese culture is extremely rude. When some simple businessman dropped my history book when he was taking a look at it when I was in Japan on the subway, he dropped it by accident because of the movement of the train, and he was horrified and thought he had been rude to me. And I ended up bending down and picking it up and just telling him, no, I get it. You're not rude. These things happen. And he was very grateful. So the cultural norm is that you're not supposed to do that. And the Japanese people are very conscientious of such small objects. The thing about material goods such as books, family heirlooms and whatnot, they're very precious in Japan. They're basically treasures in their eyes, as the Japanese people are fairly conscientious individuals. And Chosen is not in this movie.
Try obnoxious.
Yeah, to an extent that not even Johnny was. That said, where Johnny a few times wanted to take Danny on his own, Chosen never relies on his own skills to take on Danny, always relying on his flunkies to first hold down Danny or beat him up a little, and then beating him up himself. In a few fights, such as the late night fight, and he kind of tries this in the club, although that said, he does, when he lands the first hit in some of the fights, he likes to ambush Danny. Johnny at least wanted to make sure that Danny was aware he was there before lunging at him. Weirdly, Johnny had a bigger concept of honor than Chosen. Chosen had none. With that said, Miyagi seems to be more hostile towards Chosen, quickly enough. Well, after Kumiko, she seems to she absolutely despises Chosen. So that the entire idea of pairing the two in Cobra Kai seems like an insult. And to this movie, to the original director, and to the characters. But the trouble is that, well, that's Cobra Kai Season 5, which was actually a terrible season. That said, the plot moves steadily along with Mr. Miyagi finding out that Yukie never married Sato because she was still hung up on him, and she vowed to wait for him forever. In a rather touching, if heartbreaking moment, as you find out that she had wasted her entire life waiting for him to come back to her. And there's a joke Danny says at one point, why didn't you just take her and move to Alaska instead? And Miyagi jokes around, and this is before they see Yukie, and he says, no man perfect. Although the tone he says it and the way he looks at Danny implies that he's now thinking that would have been the smarter idea. That said, his father dies, and the village lights candles for the older Mr. Miyagi, and Danny ends up stepping into a bit of the role during the ceremony as son to Mr. Miyagi. And nearing the end, we get a storm after a lot of bonding scenes between Kumiko and Danny. They get a lot more scenes together than Danny and any of the other love interests in any other story of this universe. That said, at the end, there's a storm. Danny saves a little girl, as everyone knows. And that little girl is hilarious at the end because you have Danny like, if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be dancing here. And you have her, if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be here. And in a snarky rebuttal, which I adore that joke. That said, we get small scenes between Miyagi and Danny as well, where Miyagi, for example, shows him how he would have done how he tried to practice the drum technique when he was young. He goes up to rehook up the blade. Danny sets the next one off, trying to show off and try it himself, when Miyagi keeps refusing him to use a proper blade, instead putting a covering over it. And Danny cuts a huge portion of his jacket and then says, oh wow, that was stupid, sorry about that, or something to that effect. And you have Mr. Miyagi said, yeah, I said the same thing, but then my dad agreed with me that it was incredibly stupid. And I have to admit, it was, with a pointed glare and a heated tone to his voice as he glowers at Danny. So that you see that Mr. Miyagi didn't really think much of that moment over the years, but now he's looking back on that moment and he's understanding his father's rage. Because...
And I'm sure it's a good thing that Danny's not going to bring Sam there.
No, she'd probably try the same darn thing. Thankfully, I'll give Robbie credit. He'd have a bit more self-preservation. And Miguel, after the back incident probably would as well. Sam, though, is exactly... Well, she's a female version of Danny in her heart. And that's where she's a lovable character. That said, the movie has an oboe dance at the end, which is a beautiful dance from what little we see, but then it gets interrupted by the most obnoxious moron you could imagine. And said obnoxious douche proceeds to challenge Danny to a duel to the death. And, oh, FYI, I'm not referring to Kreese. I'm talking about Chosen. And Chosen and Danny engage in a almost lopsided duel to the death, as Danny, yeah, he takes a lot of hits, but every hit he throws at Chosen sends the guy reeling. When he punches him in the gut a few times, Chosen's even worse off than Danny. And it's like, wow, bro. Like, wow. And I know his fans love to pretend that Chosen was the deadliest of the three rivals. But the thing about this fight is that it convinced me, watching it this time around, because it had been about 5 years since I've seen this movie, it convinced me that Chosen's the weakest of the rivals.
When he's grown up, he's a lot more skilled. But in Karate Kid 2, Chosen leaves so many openings for Danny to take advantage of. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, and the other problem is that I now don't think he should even be a match in Cobra Kai for Mike Barnes as an adult. Even with all those decades of training, I don't think he should be a match, almost. Because it's just... He's not talented like Johnny, Danny, and Mike Barnes. He's just not. If I had to rank his skills, I'd rank him around the Dimitri level. And even then, I might rank Dimitri a bit above Chosen. I might rank him... I don't know. Like, he's just not up to the elite par of, like, Danny or Johnny or Mike Barnes. Or just below Danny, the characters like Sam, Miguel, Robbie, even Tori, I might rank above Chosen. Chosen just does not have the skills of these characters. And I know people are going to trash me in the comment section, but it's the truth. Like, the fight scene is lopsided. And then you've got the drum technique where Chosen's completely dominated. But already in the fight, I got the impression that Danny was curb stomping him. He didn't need the drum technique to beat Chosen. That was just the straw that broke the camel's back. Chosen would have been beaten. It would have been a long and grueling fight for Danny, I will grant you. But in the end, Danny would have triumphed. The trouble is, the fight scene is just a curb stomp. Now, the problem with this movie is that there are two scenes you have to ignore for Cobra Kai to make sense. And I love Cobra Kai, but I'm now kind of going, there's a problem here to an extent. And it's been a while since I watched Karate Kid 3, so I don't know how it syncs. But the trouble is, I just have a hard time now with the Amanda-Danny pairing. And I know the Amanda pairings shippers are gonna go crazy in the comment section as well. Might as well alienate everyone, from the Kreese fans, the Amanda fans, to the Chosen fans. They're all nuts. Whatever. Although I like Chosen. I have to admit, I really love him in the Cobra Kai series.
I agree. Very quirky, very calm and rational.
I love the scene when he's just like, you have Mike Barnes, I see 4 consequences here, and you have Chosen just nodding his head
the old obnoxious fight-loving Chosen comes out.
He's just nodding his head like a maniac, and you have Danny, back me up, Chosen, not realizing he's talking to the wrong guy. He should have turned to Johnny instead. Not that Johnny would have supported him, but Johnny was more likely to, considering Chosen. I love Chosen. Such a great character. Now, as an adult, I do think he should rank on the same level as, to an extent, Danny and Johnny. But I just think Mike Barnes should rank a little above them at first.
It's Mike Barnes.
Because he's the best of the rivals. He's the only one Danny couldn't even land a proper hit against. Yeah, I know he scored the 1 point, but Mike gets up immediately, as though nothing's wrong, and is more frustrated at having lost a match. Danny won the match, but in an actual fight, he could never beat Barnes. At the time. Now, there are 2 scenes in this movie that kill the Amanda pairing. And it's not... Okay, 3 scenes, actually, now that I think about it. It's not actually really the Kumiko scene that kind of kills the pairing. It's the Miyagi-Yukie scene. Because at one point, Yukie is helping Mr. Miyagi pack to return to America. And she's breaking down crying. And it's a heart-rending scene. And you have Mr. Miyagi, who ends up almost crying, asking her, "What's wrong, Yukie? What can I do to make it better? To help you? Tell me, and I'll do anything." And Yukie, sniffling, tells him, "Take me with you, away from this place." So the problem is, Yukie, no matter what, even by the time of Karate Kid 3, at least in the epilogue, I would say that she's probably finishing up the affairs at the estate before she heads over to America to live out proper married life with Mr. Miyagi. So the trouble is that to believe that he would not bring her along with him and marry her suggests that Mr. Miyagi was a cad who used her physically before abandoning her and ditching her, and that he's that sort of man. So that's going too far. Mr. Miyagi would never do that, especially to Yukie, who was his first love. Now, the thing is, in a way, Kumiko was Danny's first love. Ali was the first crush. The first real adult love, in a way, was Kumiko. And the trouble with Kumiko is that now she is divided over going to America or staying in Japan, because she's scared of leaving her home, but she knows she has to for either dance or because Yukie makes it very clear, as does Mr. Miyagi, that she would have to come along because who's her legal guardian. And Yukie would never abandon the daughter of her dead sister. So, right there. Now, the trouble is, I have a hard time believing that with proximity, Danny and Kumiko might drift apart or stop dating, because the problem is she would, no matter what, have to move to America. And she has no one else. On the other hand, the scene where Danny tells her... Now, the main thing she's mourning is the idea that if Yukie does not head to America, at the same time, she's scared of seeing Danny go. And so she's performing a ritual wherein she explains that the wives of fishermen would give rice to the sea king, the sea god, in the hopes that he might return their husband to them as soon as possible, especially during a storm. So the main thing she's praying for is for Danny to return to Okinawa to her if she is left behind, or for her to follow him. But she's scared of leaving for America because it's foreign, it's strange, and she doesn't know how she'd be received in America. And she is a little scared of Americans. While considering how 150,000 Okinawan and Japanese people were slaughtered and the Americans lost 15,000 men, and that there were 150,000 men slaughtered, I would probably argue that there's good reason to be a little anxious, as the military men from America that she's seen haven't exactly probably been the most friendly or warm, especially to a lovely Japanese girl like her. So right there, the scene is complicated, but it leaves it very clear that what she'd fear even more than going to America is being separated from Danny and Yukie. So, and then there's the ending. Just right before the words "the end" comes along, the way Yukie and Miyagi look to each other, then to Danny and Kumiko, and when Kumiko and Danny embrace, you have... What's funny is you actually have Miyagi and Yukie who look a little surprised at the bond between the two, because they knew the two were dating, they just didn't know the extent of the feelings, and then they look pleased. And I think that it would have been, because this is basically Miyagi's adoptive son and Yukie's adoptive daughter, in Japanese tradition, this would kind of be customary to unite the house again. And
I was just going to bring up the topic that
this would basically be an omiai. And the thing is, there's something poetic from a Japanese cinematic point of view. That said, there's also the aspect that Kumiko knows a bit of. Well, she knows a bit of Miyagi-Do. Apparently, a bit more in some ways than Chosen, as she's familiar with the drum technique, and that it derived originally from oboe dances, and that the thing is, the fact that she knows enough of Miyagi-Do from Miyagi's dad shows that there's a third branch of the Miyagi-Do school. There's the Sato line, then there's what Kumiko learned, and then there's Miyagi-Do. And the goal of most of these martial arts, or these different branches of these families, would be to unite them at some point together and bring the property back together. You have to think a bit in that terminology and that logic with Japan. I'm not advocating incest or anything. Like, I know there's going to be someone who's going to accuse me of that. No. I'm just saying, in Japanese literature, especially, this is a theme. And the problem is, with Karate Kid 2, is that this franchise stepped into a bit of Japanese literature. And the thing is, Karate Kid 1 was a good film, a coming-of-age story. Karate Kid 2 is a more spiritual film. And it's, to be quite honest, a Japanese-styled romance film. Shot in a manner that almost reminds me more of Akira Kurosawa. So, and I also recognize a few tropes and ideas and scenes from the Musashi novel, just in regards to just some of the tea ceremony and just some of the conversations. It reminded me of Eiji Yoshikawa and some other classical Japanese scenes from Heike Monogatari and Genji. And my beef, I guess, with the Amanda pairing is that Amanda, throughout all of Cobra Kai, works to destroy Danny. It's always about how she laughs at his karate, as she mockingly says at one point. And she always blames him for what Tori or Robbie do, when Robbie and Tori are responsible for their actions, or for Kreese, and then she goes and arranges secret meetings with Kreese. So it almost feels like she's having an affair with Kreese throughout Cobra Kai. And my problem there is that it just, you watch Cobra Kai 2-3 times, you eventually get tired of her and you want to skip her scenes. The actress is lovely and is a great actress, but the problem is the character and the writing. And the fact that she always takes Tori's side over Sam's is just so weird and bizarre. I can't imagine a parent taking the bully of their child's side and basically telling their child, you deserve it. That just... And then proceeding to try to tell the other parent a skewed version of the story so that they'll ground the kid a few times. And that happens in Cobra Kai once or twice. Such as with the one parlor or theme park or whatever where Tori pretends to be a mermaid. Yeah, Sam's a bit of a jerk, but at the same time, Tori brainwashes and sets a couple of kids to attack Sam. Then the version Amanda tells Danny turns Danny against Sam, and you actually hear the version Amanda says, and it's actually totally false, so that it's so weird. But the thing is, between that, and I'll even say how Allie behaved herself in the Johnny and Danny relationships. I'll take Allie, thank you. I'm just saying. But that seemed like a healthier relationship to me. But the thing with Kumiko is her coming to America. Now, the problem is, the second movie makes it very clear at the end she's coming to America. And her and Yuki are coming to stay. So, right there, the problem is that Mr. Miyagi is now, according to Cobra Kai, the kind of guy who'd use and throw away a woman who had loved him for more than 50 years and just toss her aside after he was done with her. That's the kind of guy it makes him out to be. And I don't think I like that interpretation.
And it doesn't help with Amanda. Every time she's in the scene with Danny, there's always some kind of conflict.
Yeah.
Whereas the few scenes where in Cobra Kai where Danny and Kumiko are together, it's like the energy is the same as it is
in Karate Kid 2. And yeah. There's no ways... The the trouble is that in this movie, you also see what happens when Kumiko and Danny enter into conflict. And there are a few scenes. They both mope, they both bicker a little, but then they talk it out. They sit down and they actually discuss it with each other rationally. And at the same time, she's a bit of a Yamato Nadeshiko archetype or stereotype, while also not being. When Chosen assaults Danny at a few points, she attacks him or throws rocks at him or a tomato at him at one point. And she even tries to strangle him to death in the duel to the death before he knocks her out, punching her out, which enrages Danny. And so the Chosen pairing with her would be ridiculous and actually an insult to this movie. But the trouble is, I'm not trying to be too pro Kumiko, but this movie sold the pairing a little too well. And Cobra Kai has sold the Amanda pairing a little too badly. And the thing is, this movie is really good, but it did not leave room for another love interest. And that's a bit of a problem.
It leaves my opinion and my vision of Cobra Kai colored.
Same.
It's like I love a lot about Cobra Kai, but the entire matter of Danny's love life,
this movie basically concluded it.
And maybe the Karate Kid franchise should have stopped at Karate Kid 2.
Maybe it should have. Although I really like Mike Barnes. And I really love Cobra Kai. I just think that when it comes to... The trouble is, it comes down to Mr. Miyagi and Yukie. Which, I'm going to be honest, I actually like that pairing in some ways more than any of the Danny pairings. And I'll even be honest, I kind of like Carmen and Johnny more than I like any of the Danny pairings. I like these ships far more than the Danny stuff. But it's just... I don't like seeing Amanda just constantly neuter Danny. It just eventually just gets tiring and exhausting. Whereas with Kumiko and Danny, you see them argue. You see them get along. You see them just kind of get frustrated with each other at a few points. Such as when you have that rice scene where Danny's frustrated trying to get her to talk, and he's trying to joke with her, and she's getting frustrated with him and with herself for not having the best use of knowledge of English. And then she eventually reveals this is for sending your husband, to pray for your husband's safe return to you. And you have Danny, now she's struggling with the concept of home, which is a big deal. But on the other hand, she doesn't want Danny to leave her. And you have Danny who then just finally realizes. And the trouble I have is that essentially with Cobra Kai, when she comes back into the series, they essentially had her and Danny repeat the same cycle and story as Mr. Miyagi and Yukie, which is to say they were in love with each other almost the whole time, and they've spent 30 to 40 or 50 whatever years, their entire lives mooning after each other without ever communicating with each other. The trouble is that Mr. Miyagi and Yukie decided that Yukie would follow Miyagi to America. She would settle in America. And I'm going to be honest, I kind of like the idea of Yukie going over to live with Mr. Miyagi and marrying him, where it gives Miyagi a bit of closure and peace. I prefer that.
He already lost a wife. At least he could have
something.
And besides, even if Yukie and Kumiko didn't join them in America, Danny's entire character in this movie, I had the impression that the moment
he graduated, he'd probably move to Okinawa. Yeah, I know. There's also this near the end, the bromance that starts to brew between him and Sato. And Sato seems charmed by him once he allows himself to be charmed by Danny. And throughout the movie, even before he's charmed by Danny, you could see him trying not to like Danny. And even jealous that... he wants that kind of bond with Chosen, but he doesn't have it, and he envies that, what Mr. Miyagi and Danny have. The problem is, though, like I said, it's just, this movie, I just got the impression Yukie would just leave for America, and she'd drag Kumiko with her, and Kumiko wants to become a dancer. So, of course, and the town that Danny and his mom settled themselves into has, I think, a few dancing schools, so that it's made very clear she'd come along. But it's just later editions. Let's rate this movie. I'm just gonna say this is a 3.5 star. This is a really long movie. It feels long. It's an epic.
I'll say 3.5 as well. This movie, there are times where it doesn't verbalize things, but there's a lot of subtlety
In the air. It's because it's shot. Once they get in Okinawa, it's shot more like a Japanese film. And I love that. I actually kind of prefer that to the more American style of Karate Kid 1 and 3 and 4, and even to an extent Cobra Kai.
And it feels like we're in Japan. Not Hollywood Japan, but Japan, Japan.
Yeah, in some ways, this movie reminds me of Last Samurai, in a lot of ways. That movie balanced the American side and the Japanese side really well as well. And although that movie did a better job showing just how fish out of water Algren is as an American, but he was an American from the 19th century, so that he understands Japan even less in a lot of ways. But that said, there's a bit more tragedy surrounding Tom Cruise's character because he's a tormented individual. In some ways, Algren is probably more like Sato or Mr. Miyagi in some ways, just utterly broken in some ways. Although Miyagi's better put together than Algren emotionally in a lot of ways, because Algren's solution is to drink his problems away. Always a healthy solution.
Well, if it worked for Miyagi.
For a time. But, yeah, tell us what you think, so long as it's not bashing, please, or, go just railing at us for our opinions regarding Amanda, Chosen, or Kreese. And don't forget to smash that like and that subscribe button. And to stay tuned for our Karate Kid 3 review and our character analysis videos of the various characters of Karate Kid 1, 2, and 3.